Really nice to meet everyone. So today our speaker suggested to speak about and talk about shaping the body politics, gender ideology and conflict in contemporary Poland and Russia. And as you know, here we have two speakers, Dr. Kate Koritsky and Dr. Kale Wilkinson. And I will present probably two of them together, and then they will present their papers. So just to keep time. So Dr. Kate Koritsky is an assistant professor in the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies at Western University, and she is a founding member of the Russian and Eastern European Studies Network at Queen's University, and we are very welcome her here in returning home. She is a comparative political socialist, sociologist interested in collective memories and group imaginaries. Her research concerns the processes by which group or national identities are imagined and reimagined, and how they implicate gender, race, and class in the creation of powerful, benefiting yet oblivious majorities. Kate's first and forthcoming book explores how collective remembering of communism is implicated in the formation of modern anti-Semitism in Poland. And her next major project concentrates on Canada. And they mean to identify what kinds of majority is being imagined in speeches of political leaders and school history textbooks. And now I will go to our next speaker. It is Dr. Kale Wilkinson, Associate Professor, Course Director, Graduate Certificate of Humanitarian Leadership, which is located at Center of Humanitarian Leadership at Deakin University in Australia. Now there are some housekeeping issues, and our audience are welcome to post their questions or raise hand. And you can post questions while speakers are presenting their papers, and later I will read them or invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So without further ado, I hand over to Dr. Kate Koritsky. Her paper, she will introduce actually better herself and her paper, so you are very welcome.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Vasily, for the invitation to the talk and for gathering us all. And thank you, Iryna, for the introduction. And I'm really pleased to be sharing the stage, so to speak, with Kale Wilkinson. And also really happy to be seeing some of the faces from my time at Queen's. In my talk, I plan first to give you the context of the protests that happened in Poland in the last few years. Second, talk about the protests themselves. And third, offer one reading of the situation that relates to the circulation and maintenance of Polish version of heteropatriarchy. So let me start the screen, share my screen so that you can see the images. So you can see the images?
Yes, we can see.
Oh, okay, very good. So let me just organize myself here on the screen. So the presentation has many images of protest art, either photographs or works created for the protests by participants and artists. As I go and talk, the actual images on the screen are by far more important than the text on the screen, so you can ignore reading and just sort of simply just soak in the images. I wanted to explain some of the images, and I will do so as I go along. The first image that you see here is a kind of iconic image of the strikes, in which you see a silhouette of a woman's face. She's rendered in black to designate mourning, and you have the red thunderbolt that kind of speaks to the rejection, eruption, some kind of rupture. The next poster you see here shows you a play on words. On the one hand, it means to speak to the English piss off, but also it includes the acronym of the currently ruling party, the Peace, about whom there'll be more in the talk. So I feel obliged to tell you that I will be swearing in this talk, and you will know why very shortly. So first, for my context, let me just advance my slides. The protests in Poland were organized around the issue of abortion and reproductive rights. So you can think about them as a canary in the mine. In other words, you can use the presence and the extent of abortion rights to assess the general extent of patriarchal organization of society. That is to say, if you have no abortion rights, you are unlikely to have many other rights important to women or women as workers, like strong anti-violence law, effective enforcement, social stigma against gender violence, effective pay equity, employment equity, funding for domestic and reproductive labor, enforcement of alimony, funding of child, elderly and disabled care, all things that fall to women, quotas in political and market spheres, and public education and health. So Poland presents a complicated picture vis-a-vis abortion rights, historically speaking. Under communism, between 1945 and 1989, abortion was legal, and women had access to employment equity as well as child support, free education and health, meals at work and in school. So they did suffer a double burden of working outside and inside the home, which they shared with women outside of communism. But unlike the women outside of communism, they had very little access to contraception. Effectively, abortion was the only contraception that they had access to. So communism ended, as you know, in 1989 with Solidarity movement, and abortion rights became contested. Since 1993, 4 years after transition to capitalism and democracy, abortion became available legally based on 3 grounds only: crime, threat to mother's life, and fetal abnormality. So I speak of it in kind of using positive syntax, but it is clear retrenchment of rights, and it involves many other rights, not only abortion. So in 2017, there were 1,057 legal abortions in Poland. 1,035 were performed because of fetal abnormality. 0 were performed because of rape or incest. So as you can see, supply was short, but the demand remained high. It is hard to measure clandestine activity, but UN estimates that there were between 80 to 180,000 abortions in Poland. Polish government estimates the number to be at 10,000. So there is no legal access, but getting an abortion, either via a pill or a procedure, is not criminalized. In 2016, the PiS, the currently and then ruling party, decided to close the loophole and decided to criminalize the act of abortion. And it decided to criminalize both the doctor performing the procedure and the woman choosing to have it. In response or in rejection of this proposal, women organized a women's strike or a Black protest on October the 3rd. The movement, that's in 2016, the movement that emerged called itself Ogólnopolski Strajk Kobiet, or National Women's Strike, or Black Monday, or Black protests. Black, as I said, was referring to the color of mourning. In 2016, 200,000 women took to the streets, women and others and their allies took to the streets in 150 towns and villages, and 500,000 stopped working. The protests were unexpected and powerful, so much so that PiS retreated. Abortion was not criminalized in Poland, but Poland remained the country with the toughest anti-abortion law in Europe. Even though abortion law has been very strict for women in Poland since 1993, in 2016, they directed their anger against the ruling right-wing party. The ruling party is like an equivalent to Republicans under Donald Trump. Between 2016 and 2020, the protests continued and often joined forces with other anti-government protests. And here, for instance, is like protecting the independence of the judiciary when the PiS was stacking the Constitutional Tribunal. Constitutional Tribunal is the highest court in Poland, and which is by now filled with PiS loyal judges. I mentioned this because this will become important in a minute. In 2020 rolls around, and the government decided in the middle of the pandemic to meddle with the abortion rights again. This time it decided to remove the ground based on which most legal abortions were actually performed. Remember that out of 1,057 abortions done in 2017, 1,035 were due to fetal abnormality. So in 2020, the piece said no longer. It did not actually propose a law on the floor of the parliament, but it took the proposed law to the by now stacked Constitutional Tribunal. And it asked the court, if we pass it, would it withstand the test of constitutionality? So the move was widely seen as a diversionary tactic. The piece was doing poorly on COVID, so it was trying to find it, distract attention and move it to other issues. Two, the move was also derided as overtly and deliberately anti-democratic. Because of COVID, people had less opportunity to protest. Three, the move was not really believed. The court's decision was to come on October the 29th, which was a Thursday, and women started protesting in anticipation of that verdict on Monday, but they didn't believe that they were actually going to issue a decision. The court has deferred making many decisions during COVID precisely because of the issue of democratic perception. Then Thursday, October the 29th, 2020 comes along, the court rules, and the proposed law is deemed constitutional. So there is a small protest outside the Constitutional Court. It's late, it's dark, the protesters hold candles, they are in mourning, they're sad, and they're resigned. And then the people who were there talk about the shift in mood that happens effectively within seconds. So all of a sudden, around 7 p.m., the mourners see a small group with a massive banner approaching. I'll show you the banner in a few minutes, and take over the street and start marching. And they start marching, they march from 7 p.m. to 2 a.m. and then for a week. They are young and old, and they are in cities and in villages. And they are profoundly and intentionally vulgar, suggesting deliberate rejection and redefinition of the scripted womanhood, denoting politeness, gentleness, acquiescence. So if I were to translate the posters that you see from the young people here, this first one is effectively rendered only in swear words. So it effectively says, fucking priests, stop meddling with my private parts. And again, all this is except priests, is rendered in swear words. The second one, abortion is a right of every person with a uterus. A few words about what is new this time around, or at 2020, the vulgarity, as I said. And what I mean by vulgar is that it is profoundly vulgar. I am a speaker of Polish. I am not shy about using swear words, but these are words that I would not be using lightly or even or ever. So if you want to kind of get a sense of this, think of the hardest word that you would say or not say, and imagine putting it in big red letters on a poster and going to the streets. So the protests are massive. Conservative estimates place the participation at 420,000 on the busiest days and take place in 410 villages. They're large, they're on par with Solidarity protests 30 and then some years ago. The protests bring young people out, and this is new and surprising. So this is surprising because Poland is a very high number of young people approving of abortion bans, and we can talk in Q&A why that is. And B, young people everywhere are produced as kind of depoliticized neoliberal subjects, and this is true of all places, simply more visible in the historically contestation-prone youth. So in Poland, young people appeared at that moment to be balking the neoliberal trend, and we'll see if this is stable and lasting. So again, young participants talk of fatigue. This is, I'm kind of translating the posters here, being ruled by old men who know nothing of their lives and plight. They talk of the joy of the protests, of gaining consciousness. It's a very funny language of the second wave feminism, of feeling power. Some people call it an angry protest, and it is, but others call it a carnival of freedom, which it also is. Some of it has to do with COVID, of course, some of it has to do with peace, but not all of it. So what is also new and unprecedented is that protesters enter and disrupt churches. Once there, they again are not often and always polite. So this is not as dramatic as Pussy Riot in Russia, and it is not done frequently. So I don't want to overstate it, but it has never happened before. And it matters when the barrier is broken. So I want to give you a few seconds to absorb this image and its visible, palpable anger and rejection. The translations of words are, this is war, wypierdalać, which is fuck off, and then strike kobiet, women strike. What is perhaps less visible, is how the poster appropriates or gestures to the solidarity look and in font and style, its liberatory feel and its mass character. Here on the right, you see a famous solidarity poster announcing the first election in June 1989, and on the left you see a furious woman telling powers that be to F off. What is also important to note is that the church becomes the target together with the peace, and that other parties or the opposition do not gain anything here. So the narrative that this is mainly a populism issue or that this is just simply the issue of this party will not quite hold. It appears that women in Poland, again, women and their allies, see all political elites as an old pact of a men pact, that a coterie now being rejected. So now we have this explosion. So let me offer a reading or an explanation of it. So let me start with one of the main adversaries of women, the peace, the party in power. The party is very, very open about having a theocratic agenda. It is, in other words, it is very interested in making Poland ruled by church morality and in making nationality tied to Christianity. It is populist. It is a populist party in that it ran both 2015 and 2019 election on the construction of moral people being threatened by corrupt elites. It is a right-wing ruling party because it defines and creates its enemies. In 2015, it was a communist Jew, and in 2019, it was a gender ideology. So I will explain that next. It, by the way, won both times, and it won a majority. It was unprecedented. Majorities were not to be had before. So let's unpack this gender ideology construction that is the enemy peace was and is fighting against. So as you know, feminists and people involved in gender, queer, and trans studies see gender and sexuality as social facts, not natural essential facts. One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. Furthermore, many of them analyze the structures that make those social facts appear as if they were natural, God-given, normal, and universal. Lastly, they seek change because they see the social fact of gender as it is performed in and through different cultures, existing in the context of patriarchy, that is a hierarchy. So opponents of gender ideology, that is people like the Peace, all the Church, and many others in Polish mainstream, present the work of feminists decoding gender as work of foreign, external, disturbed, hostile deviance. And here are direct quotes from Polish press. Homosexualization of society, fighting lesbians, lesbians hating men, family phobia. Opponents of gender ideology defend essential roles of man hunter and woman firekeeper. This may sound very archaic and primitive, actually, but what it does is explicitly confirms men's natural right to rule over men, over women, over children, over family, over values, over life. And when they talk about it, they present gender as an ideology in such a way that it becomes associated with other ideologies, communism and fascism, which in Poland are made to be equally bad. So in Poland, to call something an ideology is to render it an evil threat. and especially an existential threat to the nation. With different intensities, it's not unlike Canada, where ideology is always someone else's problem, and it is a problem. So you have an ideology, whereas I have informed political opinions, but it matters that it's a weaker repudiation, and it doesn't have that connection to communism. So here is the encapsulation of the iconography of this nationalized fear. You have the image of the cross, you have the draped red and white representing Polish flag, and you have a pile of threats at its feet. Many of the boxes that you will see refer to 7 deadly sins, but there are also some others. So apart from hate and greed, you will also have gender and LGBT. First, let me look at ideology when it is actually used by those who study it, like sociologists, theorists, feminists. When it is used by those people who study ideology, it represents a collective unconscious. It is that which hides power relations, the social construction of categories, and makes them appear natural and essential. It also perpetuates the power status quo. We see hierarchy as natural. We don't even see it as hierarchy, and we don't rebel against it. So ideology lives, we can say, and can be seen and studied in the common sense notion, taken for granted scripts or our daily practices. The clearest example is a woman presented as a natural nurturer and carers. Having women appear as naturally caring relieves others from having to share the burden or having to fund it. In short, the work of ideology in a social space is to hide power relations by making them appear natural, preserve the status quo, and form and maintain normal, powerful majorities, that is, universal human beings, privileged by not seeing that they have a gender and a race which benefits them. So just gender may be understood as a structure on ideology that feminists decode and oppose. So why, let me spell it out, like what were the stakes of this game, and why did peace attack it? Why did it make it into a threat? Or in more creative way, what fears became visible in the attack or the backlash against the structure of gender? So the first will be the fear over masculinity, as I mentioned, and its relation to control over women, world, universal personhood. As most of you will know, women's rights to property, divorce, vote, wages, marriage without father's consent are very new. They're barely 100 years old, and they're fragile and unfinished. And feminists seek to expand them. So they are profoundly unsettling to established interests. They also represent the stake of the game, represent the fear over motherhood as the only valorized female role. And lastly, and perhaps most interestingly, they represent the fear over heteronormative family as the only valorized community in neoliberal states. Other than revealing fears and protecting interests, the party was also pursuing a successful electoral strategy of creating national enemy, that is feminists and gays, and mobilizing support. And it worked. So such is a distribution of power in contemporary Poland. It looks bleak, but it is always so when people start working towards a change. Only in retrospect do things appear possible. Thank you. Okay, let me stop sharing so that I can start seeing.
Also, thank you so much, Professor Korycki. And now I will invite Kale Wilkinson to present their topic, gender ideology and, so to say, traditional family values in Russia beyond LGBT human rights. So we can see your presentation. And yeah,
Perfect.
thank you.
Thank you.
I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Iryna. Oh wow, I've got the hard job of going after Kate. So firstly, to say thank you very much for having me, and particularly for Kate for inviting me to this, and then Vasily very kindly going along with it. So right, I will endeavour to stick to time as well as Kate has done. She has, as I expected, set up the groundwork beautifully, so I think I'll be able to build on it reasonably well, so bear with me. As with Kate's presentation, don't worry too much about the text. If anyone does want the slides afterwards, you're very welcome to them. They do have quite a lot of detail on them because I wanted to kind of build my case a bit more. Because I always feel a little bit like I'm in the realm of, if not conspiracy theory, then certainly needing to show how the correlations come about while not becoming too alarmed by them as well. So in terms of my title, my starting point has been LGBT rights, because that's where my focus has been for the last 5-10 years in terms of looking at the development of LGBT rights. And again, to echo Kate on this one, in many ways, I've seen them as the canary in the coal mine for what's been happening in Russia. People who've been studying the women's movement for a very long time may disagree with me. I think there's certainly, one could say, women are also the canaries in the coal mine, as will become more and more evident. But let's unpack it and see where we go. So I'm starting out, if I can move through a slide, not with a recap of LGBT rights or Russian political homophobia. And I would distinguish between political homophobia as something that is imposed by the state on people and that affects people's lives, rather than making any generalization about Russian people being homophobic. I think Alexander Kondakov wrote a wonderful piece some years ago now entitled "Do Russians Give a Damn About Homosexuality?" And yet we keep on coming back to this very simplistic discourse that Russians are homophobic. And it's really problematic in terms of actually unpacking what's happening and how these different tropes, discourses, securitizations, threat narratives are being used to achieve particular political agendas. So we can actually take traditional values right back to the beginning of Putin's regime, so 20 years ago now. And right back when he first came to power, he was already flagging the demographic decline of Russia as a threat to the Russian state. And it is literally, in the way that it's been framed, an existential threat. It is, will there be enough Russians to at least keep control of Russia? Or, is the future of the nation literally in doubt? We can see that actually the population has stabilized a bit in the last few years. The annexation of Crimea was quite helpful for adding several million people. But at the same time, the total fertility rate has remained really low. And this is going to be Putin's biggest problem, and remains the problem, is that even if you keep your population up, you've got to get enough people reproducing, and you've got to get the right people reproducing. So not your immigrants, but your proper Orthodox Russians, reproducing at a rate, I think they've said 2.4 would be needed, and yet they're aiming for 1.7. So at the moment, they've still got a problem. So through the 2000s and from 2006, they did try a lot of sensible policies in terms of incentivizing women to have more children. There was a lot more material support, there was a lot more benefits, there was expansion of women's maternity leave, for example. It had some impact. They estimate approximately 4 million babies were born as a result of these policies, so that did add to it. But at the same time, there's bigger problems at play. There's the economic issues, there's insecurity, there's double burdens, there's simply the cost of living, and so on. And then COVID hit, and that's made things significantly worse. So this is really the problem that Putin has set himself to solve. What's been interesting is, as the policies have failed, what we have seen, and particularly since the mid-2000s, is an increasing drawing upon the creation of existential threats as a way to try and incentivize people to conform to the policies. So this is something that I've conveniently labeled the unholy queer peril, mainly because LGBT people have been at the front of it. So that's starting on the left-hand side. We can certainly add feminists in. Feminism has been declared, certainly by the Russian Orthodox Church, to be a very dangerous phenomenon that takes women away from their natural role. Then we can add in the atheists, so anyone who is not a believer in itself, because that means you're moving further away from natural roles. And then we can also include people who don't want to get married and have children, especially women, because somehow it's a little bit more acceptable for men. but only just. Although even on that one, I would note that some of the allegations and reasons they've made against gay men, for example, has been that they don't contribute to the production of the nation, the reproduction of the nation. So this is our queer peril that has become the figure against which traditional values have been created. So increasingly, Putin has explicitly identified traditional values as both the solution, but also the thing that needs protecting. He became increasingly explicit about it domestically from about 2013. Prior to that, it was often expressed in international fora within UN documents. It was often framed within cultural rights and within trying to trade off human rights against cultural rights in a very zero-sum way. Domestically, it's become increasingly strident, however. So from 2013 onwards, which coincided with the adoption of the federal anti-gay law, I will come on to what it was actually called later, it's been a very explicit move to articulate Russian culture in a way that is based in Christian values, that is based in morality, and that asserts that we need to live in a particular way if Russian civilization, and in fact Western civilization, is to survive. So this has been followed by declarations that the liberal order is dead, that the rest of the world is doomed. If anyone follows the international right wing, you may also have seen claims that Putin is defender of Christianity, or in fact, we see a bit of Russian messianism come through in terms of the idea that Russia is going to save the Christian world. It's heady stuff. More recently this year, we've seen Putin really double down on this. It's part of national security strategy. It's been increasingly centered within Russian political discourses and the actions of the Putin regime. So these two articles, headlines from RAA Novosti, are from speeches, one at a women's forum, but explicitly saying we are going to defend traditional values. We believe in traditional family values. The two are increasingly being used interchangeably. And this is about the morality, the moral foundations of our society. Now, every time we get talking about traditional values, one of the first questions that comes up is, what exactly are they? Now, helpfully, the Russian government launched a presidential decree project just at the end of December, actually entitled The Foundations of State Policy for the Preservation and Strengthening of Traditional Russian Spiritual Moral Values. I got all excited about this because I thought, finally, I'm going to actually get a sense of what they really mean. And it is a long, long list. So I picked out the list of things that it includes. I haven't listed the list of things that threaten it, although I would note that it includes anything that's not traditional and the US. And then it basically keeps on saying that if we don't do something about it, and if we don't actively promote traditional values, then society is going to fall apart. This is the very, very short version. Yeah, if you're wondering how it's going to fall apart, then it's going to be drug use, breakdown of family, lack of respect for people, basically all of these antisocial phenomena. So in some ways that wasn't very useful, but it was also a good indication that of the institutionalization of this discourse and the way in which it is being used to really shape the Russian state and to shape policies that are coming through that are going to affect everyone's lives, because this is going to come down in a variety of ways to different people. What it also speaks to internationally, and this is where I'm sort of putting my IR hat on for a moment, is a concept that I would call moral sovereignty. This is one of these pictures where really we could do an entire talk just on this. I have blanked out the one swear word in the interests of being a semi-kulturny человек. But yeah, it doesn't take much guessing. There's been variations of this going around the internet for many years, and it's this idea that even if Russia isn't a superpower in the sense that it's got the military might anymore, again, this may be topical at the moment, it is still finding different spaces to assert sovereignty. And morality and culture has become increasingly the grounds on which it feels it can be influential internationally as well, but also as a way to mobilize people and actually be uber patriotic. And we can see also very, very crude stereotypes about queerness as something that is a Western phenomenon versus this incredibly patriotic, going right back to the Boyars idea of generations of Russia, which again harks back more to Rus. And as a country that has a superpower that has never been conquered. Genghis Khan may disagree, but who am I to take issue with historical narratives too much? So this concept has been surprisingly powerful as something that gives them space to play in, and a forum in which they can unite people, because the concept of sovereignty therefore gets articulated in particular ways. And domestically, which is where I'm interested today, it's become what I would call an intimate regime in terms of it is a system of regulating sex and gender to form particular configurations of it that align with the idea of traditional values and let it to be furthered. So pronatalism already started with the demographic crisis. Heterosexist, yes, definitely heterosexist, and preferably very masculinist at the start. Also explicitly homophobic often, although Putin himself is very careful to distance himself from this, but still letting the popular homophobia come through. Certainly since 2013, gay hate crimes have doubled in Russia. And then I think world attention has well spotted the Chechen purges that took place in 2017, and in fact a year later as well. So that vigilantism, that idea of actually mobilizing people to be, to help protect the body politic and ensure that its morality has very much come up. And that's also, we can see that with Cossacks as well, as a group who are seen as holders of morality in Russia. And in fact, people may recall the whipping of Pussy Riot by a Cossack that achieved detention. You will have guessed from all of this that it is deeply patriarchal and very paternalistic. Gender essentialism, it's not explicit, but certainly this idea that there are proper gender roles, and particularly for women, but also if you've got to be a proper man in terms of serving your country, doing your duty. Theocracy is always a difficult one, given the Russian Orthodox Church tight entwinement with the Russian state, but we can certainly say that this is explicitly anti-secular. That's probably me being a social scientist and a bit cautious. But certainly there is seen to be a central role for orthodoxy within this regime and how it is going to shape it. And then as we move up, it does become nationalist, and this is the one that's received more attention. Populist as well, in terms of serving to divert from crises, in terms of keeping people not paying attention to other losses of rights. And then it is also explicitly geopolitical. This is being able to do this at home gives Putin a lot of cachet with right-wing groups internationally as well, including in the US, as well as with the more European anti-gender ideology crew, including Viktor Orban, for example. So let's take a look at what this intimate regime actually includes, because this is all nicely abstract. So one of the central things that has happened is it isn't just about saying we don't like the gays, but it's about promoting a particular vision of the family. And it's a vision of the family that we could describe as the family as a little church. So it's a little unit, it's the base unit of society. And ideally there should be at least 3 children. So if it's not reproductive, and it's not generating that, and if it's not a proper marriage in which the man is the head of the family and the woman is going to be the caregiver, then this isn't quite right. So this is where the flag real family comes from. Anyone who watches France may also recognize that this does look like a very, very deliberate rip-off of the flag that a right-wing pro-family group was using there, just with pink. And when it came out, there was a lot of entertainment on the internet with remixes of this flag. We've also got this being formalized as family policy. So this is about enshrining the family ever more deeply. So Kate spoke about the valorization of the family as a particular unit. This takes it to one higher level, I would argue, and say that this is something which is sacrosanct, it's sacred, and it has to be there. It's an organizing principle. It's something that can be used to structure society more deeply. And predictably, this is great for anyone who happens to fit into a heteronormative nuclear family, but even then it's going to be a little bit constraining. But this has led to cases where people have been actively told you're not a real family. I would also say that you're not a real family is something that we heard a lot in the UK in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. So this is not a uniquely Russian phenomenon. I think that's really important to stress, that all of these discourses have been seen before in other places. It's not something that we can exoticize or say is unique to Russia by any means. As part of that protection of family, was an indication of how not only for a particular abstract configuration, but how it wants families to look in real life. So these are 3 cases that have occurred within the last few years. The first one from 2017, where a foster mother who had a double mastectomy due to medical problems with her breasts was then accused of being transgender and gender deviant, and her foster children were actually taken into care. So this is probably the strongest case, and certainly one of the few that's come to light that really gives you an indication of just how reactive the state is to allegations of gender nonconformity or things where your body doesn't fit. And the way in which particularly I think moral panic about gender diversity, gender nonconformity can really escalate very, very quickly. Second group that's been caught up because of the prohibition on same-sex couples adopting non-gay families has been single fathers who've been having children via surrogates, partly because as soon as you're doing that and you're a father who's having a baby with a surrogate, the assumption has been made that one is gay. So regardless of the evidence. So it's not actually about what your sexuality or identity is, it's about what you are perceived to be and whether or not that has been securitized. As well as that, we have seen gay parents flee with children so that they would not be separated from them. This was one case that happened in 2020. Equally, many of you may have seen or read Masha Gessen's accounts of deciding to lead Russia again for these very same reasons. So certainly these are very real fears. I mean, this is the standard one that people don't rip up their life and leave unless they have to. But if you've got a choice of losing your children or leaving, then most people will take the opportunity to leave if they have it. But certainly again indicates that how it's all intertwined in terms of if you're part of that queer peril, you are in danger. Those examples also speak to the centrality not only of promoting the family, but it's also framed as protecting children. And this is 2 parts to this. Firstly, it's about ensuring their healthy development. And importantly, that's not only healthy physical development, that's mental, spiritual and intellectual development as well. And as part of that, the aim seems to be the preservation of their innocence and prevention of anything that might corrupt that innocence until the age of 18. And probably one of the most interesting examples of this has been Iryna Mizulina, who's been one of the leading right-wing women supporting this very traditional values challenge, was actually explicit in saying, children don't have sexuality until the age of 18. They don't need to know anything about it. They should be completely innocent, which was kind of fascinating in terms of such an absolute statement, but made very, very clear the logic that's at play. There's been no sex education in schools since attempts were made and failed in the 1990s to introduce it. But what has been interesting is there's been increasing focus on the introduction of compulsory spiritual and moral education, which is very much about promotion of traditional values, ensuring that people actually have the correct principles. And this has become compulsory since 2012. There's also been anecdotal reports of orthodox lecturers, as they've been called, or teachers being invited in to talk about family values and morals with children. And predictably, this tends to be a little bit fire and brimstone and deeply homophobic and deeply anti any gender diversity, or in fact anti-women as well. We've also seen a range of laws come in more generally that are about protecting children from negative and harmful information. So this one, 2011, was about the internet in particular. And they're very clear that they don't want to protect children and coddle them, but equally they don't want their moral development harmed. More concrete measures followed not only in 2013, but 2012, we had the ban on Americans adopting Russian children, and this was then expanded to a ban on adoptions by foreign same-sex couples in 2013. And then in 2013, we also saw the so-called anti-gay law, which by the time it became a federal law, and in contrast to the St. Petersburg law and some of the other regional ones, actually the language had changed to be, it was about preventing the propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations amongst minors. And so it was firmly moved into this idea of traditional values. If you're feeling cynical, you could argue that that is a way around the allegations of homophobia. I think on balance, I would probably say it fits better with the discourses overall. It gives the space and it speaks to the ideology that they're actually seeking to promote, rather than LGBT people specifically. The other one, and there are direct correlations here with Poland that have actually led to articles entitled there are concerns about Russia going down the Polish path. The Polski Put is increasingly restrictive attitudes towards abortion. And this is again really where we can see the traditional values configuration coming through so clearly, and the way in which it is gendered and the way in which it is seeking to have an impact on embodied life experiences. So I'm not going to run you through all of these date by date, but as you can see, since 2013, it's been restrictions coming through. 2020, the medical grounds actually excluded abortions on the grounds of fetal abnormalities. They got taken out completely. And then in 2021, now they're moving back towards measures aimed at halving the number of abortions, because despite the fact they have dropped dramatically since Soviet times, Russia is still relatively up there in terms of number of abortions happening per year. These have been protested in the same way as the anti-gay laws have been protested. The numbers are never big enough, and also the crackdowns tend to be pretty vicious in terms of the willingness to arrest people. So you can see here a protester against the abortion laws in St. Petersburg, who is actually referencing the Polish women in terms of leading the way and examples for it. And yet, unfortunately, so far it has not had much, if any, impact. The other way that we do very much see this, and where it becomes about women's rights especially, although also children, this is where the queers kind of drop out a little bit, is going to be in the domestic violence situation that's developed in the post-Soviet space. So until 2008, there were no official statistics on domestic violence in Russia. But in that time, certainly in the 1990s, there was moves towards opening shelters, NGOs providing services for women in particular affected by domestic violence. It was hoped, therefore, that from 2008, with these figures being released, that there might be substantive action taken to address domestic violence. But actually what we saw was the complete opposite. As the situation became more geopolitically tense, as Russia became more confident, but also more critical of the West, and more determined to go its own way, increasingly civil society became shut down, services shut, shelters shut. The 2012 foreign agent law in particular meant that services lost funding or had to operate under being labelled foreign agents. So it all became far less supported. Things got even worse then in 2017 with the decriminalisation of battery offences and domestic violence cases categorised as private prosecutions. So as Yelena Mizulina, again, my favourite person, said, it seems a shame to break up families for a slap. So the downplaying of it, and the argument was that this was breaking up families unnecessarily, that this led to people not being able to be with their children. So very little recognition of the violence that can occur within a family context. Women's activists reported a spike in abuse cases, as well as a lot of police inaction. And there are some truly horrific reports about what happened to some women that year as men felt emboldened to really act out their violence. It's also very noticeable that even if we think 8,500 women dying due to domestic homicide might look good, compared to the 2008 stats, it was actually approximately, I'm just going to stop that. Thank you. This is actually 1/10 of the world's deaths that year due to domestic violence. So 1 in 10 victims of domestic violence in that year was Russian, approximately. That it is a massive, massive tragedy. It's a crime. The only little bright spark on this is that earlier last year, the Constitutional Court found that these legislative changes were unconstitutional and has ordered stronger laws. So that's, you know, a monumental victory in many ways, but it's also not going to get back a lot of the changes that have happened, and also the fact that there is now a more ingrained culture of domestic violence. So we've got those three ones of the family, protecting children, abortion, or not protecting women might be the easy way to say it. Then the final one that we do need to mention, because I've sort of skirted around the Russian Orthodox Church, because we could talk for hours about that one, is also the way that traditional values have also involved protecting religion. So this came in particularly after the Pussy Riot punk prayer case in 2012, was the anti-blasphemy clauses that would come in. And this has very explicitly been to play to domestic conservative audiences. There's only actually been 19 prosecutions as of last year under this law, and not all of them have resulted in convictions. So it's very much, it's a law that's designed to intimidate. It's also designed to make religious supporters feel supported as well. And it served its purpose in terms of, there was crisis over the elections in 2012, 2013, the rigging of those. This was a good way to bring back a support base in very quickly. So I think this is where I'm kind of moving back very quickly. So feel free to question me as I correlate, but do not indicate causation necessarily. I would argue very much that we're looking at traditional values as a very strategic narrative that is being used deliberately to shape the body politic, but also to create different alliances and, you know, find different bedfellows, if we want to extend the analogy. So it's very much about the advancement of a far-right agenda. It's about nationalism. It's about presenting the nation state in its form of Mother Russia and the discourses that come with that. It's about ensuring that it's seen as an orthodox state and that it's orthodoxy at the center of that. This may be due to using the Russian Orthodox Church as a source of support. It's arguable who needs who more on that one. And it certainly speaks to an increasing authoritarianism and a dislike of liberal democracy as a way of operating. And that will come as no surprise. So far, so predictable. Certainly, it does serve to consolidate power very effectively. Domestically, this has been proven time and time again. Anyone who knows Valerie Sperling's fantastic book, Sex, Politics and Putin, will have seen how this works in relation to using homophobia. Once you look out towards traditional values and bring in a lot more of the discourses and the way in which it's being articulated, I think it becomes even clearer. It also serves internationally as a way of consolidating networks, so the global right way, and ensuring that one has a voice in that as well. And it is also, as you would expect, deeply, deeply gendered. So this is masculinist, heteropatriarchal, and deeply misogynist in terms of devaluing women at the same time as we're talking about traditional values, meaning dignity. It's somewhat paradoxical in that sense. What's happened more recently is, even though we can say that gender ideology has been evident implicitly, is it has now become more explicit. So just at the end of last year, Putin has begun actually explicitly pushing back on the idea of gender fluidity, so non-binary categories, and sees this as part of the decadent decline of the West. And particularly framing it in ways that is about upholding this idea of humanity that's very religiously informed. It would have very similar ideas with right-wing Catholic theology, for example. So the idea that we're made in God's image and we've got to stick with that, it's got to be natural. But also interesting to see that he's beginning to draw on other tropes that can be drawn in. So referencing the Bolshevik Revolution and the bad things that happened after that. So the distancing from communism as well. So I think what we're probably going to see is a lot more explicit coalitions. I think what we're likely to see is a lot more pushback and a use of this language to really be able to shore up the position of traditional values, particularly now it is becoming institutionalized. So unfortunately, I'm not feeling particularly hopeful that things are going to improve on a state level. But to end on a slightly more positive note, there is always resistance to this. And certainly there are efforts going on to find those strategic narratives to push back, to say that this is only one configuration of traditional values. It's not the only definition that's coming through. So both of these pictures, I think, speak to that and speaks to the fact that even if we're not feeling very hopeful at the moment, there is always that room for contestation, but it's going to be a long, slow process that we need to keep sticking with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilkinson. And I'm opening now a floor for discussion, and we have enough time to hear all your comments and questions to our speakers. Yeah, so far, we do not have questions in the chat, but you are very welcome to post questions if you feel more comfortable. You can raise your hand and ask your question by yourself. So, so far, I do not have, yes, we see a couple of hands. So I would invite Iryna ask the question first, and then Professor Manley.
Thank you for two excellent presentations. I did a PhD on women's studies back in the 90s, and I'm interested in the fact I was looking at the second wave of feminism in North America and in Europe. And in North America, the focus was a lot to do with equity defined in economic terms. And in Europe, there was a lot more diversity going on, but I was paying attention mostly to what Lucy Irigaray was defining as the politics of difference. And I'm curious, neither of you mentioned economics and the position of women economically as a topic. And I just wonder if you can touch on that for Russia and Poland. Either one of you.
I will start just to give Kai a moment to regroup, since to just give her a little bit more time. That is an excellent question, and I'm not necessarily sure. I think that I didn't talk about the economic issues because the abortion protests were about abortions. I didn't also talk about the fact that there were clearly, there are linkages between abortion movements and LGBTQ communities, that they're very tightly linked, that the issue, I was just, I think, concentrating on it because many see it as a certain floor of women's rights, but they do, as I say, come as a package of rights in which the anti-violence legislation, employment equity, wage parity is all. If you don't have abortion, you're very unlikely to have the others. If you have abortion, you may have the others, but not necessarily so. And then the fight becomes about those steps. So it kind of speaks, I think, to this idea of fragility of women's rights, how new they are, how incredibly uncertain, and how needing to be entirely protected, although I am very wary of using the word protecting after I've heard Kai's presentation. The language of protection is problematic, but they need nurturing, and they need to be defended, obviously. But my presentation was on abortion as a kind of as a linchpin of what is not there, and there is absolutely there are no other protections. There is no such thing as protection of as anti-violence protection, which has material dimensions, and there is no such thing as equity, although with one exception, Polish political parties all have parity, so and are successful in that, but in some small sense have has material implications. So excellent point. It was just simply to suggest that that's just the floor. That's just the most certainly not the ceiling.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I'm going to post a link to a 2018 article that Daria Uchova wrote, which actually starts to address how traditional values have served as a way of making sense of gender inequality and, in fact, the division of labor and the division of pay, amongst other things. So in that sense, I mean, traditional values has very much served as a way to almost naturalize inequality, and a way to, I suppose, paper over the paradoxes of neoliberalism, and saying that we want to go back to this very traditional way of life at the same time as there is massive rampant inequality. You know, we haven't quite got to the stage where we're seeing the prosperity gospel come up in Russia yet, but it can't be too far off. And when it hits, then it's going to become even more evident just how much of this is a global right thing, because then you can really make the links explicit with evangelical Christians who are operating, you know, in many countries. So I think that's the economics on that level. It serves as a justification. The other thing is that part of this is a result of, even though they have been providing more direct material financial support to mothers, it simply hasn't been enough. You know, the economic uncertainty is too much to persuade people to go forth and multiply. You know, and if you're in a country where you don't feel stable, then, you know, it's a very difficult ask for someone to say, well, even if we give you $700, even if we do this, is this going to be a sufficient amount of money for it? The final factor I'd also mention is feminism is still a word that provokes very strong feelings in Russia, and frequently not positively. Gender equality in the Soviet Union, and Kate alluded to this as a Polish experience as well, anti-communism, was very much a double burden. And something that did impose a lot and did not actually mean equality in any meaningful sense. So a lot of people are still very, very leery of the word feminist. It will bring forward ideas of being a man-hater, of, you know, being someone who is in some way not conforming, which one isn't. So the stigma is still certainly there in a lot of ways. And that again means that we don't get to the inequalities, because it's back to a natural position of a woman's place is in the home. And this is the natural order of things.
Thank you.
Sorry, if I could just add one more thing, because listening to Kai made me think about this. Again, thank you for this incredible question. But I think, so there are two things to be said, that if you're thinking about the vision of a community, that these narratives that we are describing rest on an assumption and promotion and institutionalization of deepest modes of inequality. Women's place is in the home, with the children, etc., etc. And that's the only, so that immediately removes any notion of economic inequality, economic equality. And the second comment, many commentators in Poland who are opposing to peace are seeing it as a quasi-welfarist party, because peace introduced the payments to families in order to promote the generation of children. So there was this outcry among the liberal circles that this is going to ruin the country and blah, blah, all that. And this was like a welfare state was almost communism, without understanding that the basis of this was a natural reproduction of a nation and not a universal entitlement that would include every member of a community. There's nothing welfarist about it, even though it lifts some people out of poverty and it helps some women. So it's a by far more complicated gesture than simply decrying them as proto-communists, which they are not.
Yes, Professor Manley, you wanted to ask?
Thank you. Thank you both for really fascinating papers. I had a meeting that I was supposed to be attending now, and I just wrote saying I'm going to be late. So, which is a testament to how rich these papers are. I had first just a comment and then question for both of you. The comment was, I was thinking, I think, Kate, you made a persuasive case about the sort of the way that abortion rights are sort of an indicator of where things stand on another front. And I'm just thinking historically in the 1920s, there was an idea, if I'm not mistaken, at least, in the Soviet Union when abortion was legalized, that abortion was only going to be required until we got to a place where all of those other rights were protected and women had full equality. So it's interesting to reflect on abortion at that time was seen as a necessity only because women didn't have full economic, political, social equality. We're at a very different moment, obviously, now. So that's just a comment, and either of you are welcome to respond to that. My question is, if to both of you, is about sort of the differences in what we're seeing right now in contemporary Poland and Russia, and maybe a reflection on why. My impression, clearly it's very striking that the kind of protests we've seen in Poland is simply not apparent in Russia. And Kai, in your talk, you gestured to some of the reasons why, but I also wonder if clearly abortion, it would seem to me also that abortion has been less central to the traditional values agenda in Russia than, at least it's been certainly less central to sort of what I've seen. And I wasn't aware of all of the changes that you sort of laid out, but it seems like it's been less central. And I wonder if that's because there's a sense that will not play as well, that there is still an enduring sense that abortion is something that women have a right to, and that it is moving too strongly on that front could be likely to generate opposition, if not outright protest, whereas there is a much longer legacy of responding to feminism and LGBTQ issues with there's a greater, lengthier tradition of homophobia, of anti-feminism, and I'm wondering to what degree is that correct, and do we see differences in the two countries in the sort of assumptions about the way the population itself might respond? So does this reflect anything about popular attitudes?
Great question. Kate, do you want me to start off on this one? Okay, cool. Yes, on the Soviet one, in terms of, yes, abortion would just be a phase. Yes, it's interesting how so much of what the Soviet Union started out with in the 20s then took dramatic turns once ideological purity hit the bedroom. And yeah, things went a very different direction. Certainly, if we think about where they started, I think it's also interesting how quickly it gets rolled back. And this is, again, an international thing. If we're looking at what's happening in the US at the moment, they're never quite as fixed as we want them to be or think they should be. In terms of the differences between the two, the two big differences that I can immediately say is, one, European Union membership. But also the idea of Europe, I think, and European values plays into this. And secondly, the strength of civil society. The Russian regime has been very, very careful not to let civil society become strong. So there is activism. It would be a complete mistake to say that there is not activism going on in Russia regarding abortion's rights, regarding women's rights. It's grindingly slow, it's low level, and it's far less visible, and particularly because protests often mean engaging in strategic litigation, going through processes of getting arrested, and really doing the tough activism of keeping on going and trying to get change. But the fact that they have managed to get the Constitutional Court to declare that the 2017 changes were unconstitutional is incredible. given the circumstances and given how much everything is stacked against them. And that's not just right at the top with Putin, that's right through for the committees for women, children and families. It's right through from all of the policies that are coming through. So I think it's a very different context in terms of what can be achieved publicly. We've also got the issue of control of the media, so a lot of it's not going to get publicised, and simply the size of the country means that that's harder as well in terms of achieving critical mass. If it's not in Moscow or St. Petersburg, there may not be much attention paid to it, and certainly internationally that's likely to be the case as well. So I think those are the differences. I suppose we could also mention different churches, although I'm struck by the similarities as well on that one. And certainly the way that the different contexts have played out, I think is fascinating.
So I thank you for an amazing question, Rebecca. I don't know if my answer is right. I'm just making this up as I go along. So let's hear it out and see what to make of it. But in some ways, in both places, it seems to me that the stakes have to do with the kind of essentialized gender, the role of the family, and the role of the woman, definition of the woman, etc. So there's this gender sexuality question is enmeshed. However, the spear point is different. In Poland, Polish authorities, you could say, made a mistake by going after women's rights, because it's somewhat easier to organize a large coalition around something like a woman's right. If this was about a boy in a dress, or if this was about LGBTQ parade in Warsaw, you wouldn't have 500,000 people on the streets. Not because Poles are more homophobic or less homophobic, etc. It's just that issue doesn't have as much traction for them. Whereas if you go after women's issues, well, we all know women. So, so I think it in some ways it was a tactical mistake to actually, and as I say, those issues are enmeshed everywhere. And as you can see, the leaders of Polish movement are very much closely working with LGBTQ communities. They're members of that community, etc., etc. But the issue was a one that was easier to mobilize on, so just simply as that. And I think the second one might have been COVID factor. Just the fact that people were simply needing to say no to many things. But I don't want to overdo it. So that's just a kind of a possibility. That it was just simply a different issue picked as for attack.
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to take the liberty to ask a question and connect it with previous questions coming from Dr. Tymiński and Dr. Manley. So I was also thinking about economic inequality in this context, about opportunity to do abortions in Poland, and some issues regarding, for instance, queer parenting in Russia, and how all of this these legal implications and consequences that people try to avoid in their home countries in Poland and Russia respectively, they forced people that have money and they have more freedom to go, for instance, to Germany if they have this option, or to go to Ukraine, for instance. And they, in this case, the clinics, for instance, in Ukraine and other neighborhood countries, they profited from this situation. And so my question is regarding like how people were finding the solution to do, not to go only to the protest like as a group of people, but how they coped with this situation in their countries. I mean, what was their individual responses, how they find as a better way how to solve the problem, and is this connects also to the overall situation in the region, which is very different, and they just try to use this situation and different approaches to in those countries. So maybe you can comment on this, and yeah, thank you.
I can go first on this very, very quickly. The access to abortion, such as it is, of course, is mediated by access to, I don't want to say class mediated because that's just kind of primitive, but it most certainly becomes easier for people with money to either go places or to simply purchase the pill online. And there are, this will be by far easier to people who have access to technology. So obviously it now becomes access to abortion such as it is becomes class mediated. Let's just put it that way. But you asked also how people organized around it, and this was kind of incredible. Around the last protest, there were young people organizing websites. Sorry, and I hate to give credit to Zuckerberg for anything, but they were actually going on Facebook and creating cosmetic selling, what's the name, pages, in which there was a code, and the code was in some ways transmitted to whoever was coming onto the page. It's like, order this and that, and that's what you will get. And then this person was then translating it into, and then buying the products, and this kind of sprung up very quickly in recognition of the fact that many people may not know how to buy a morning after pill, how to buy it, you know, in Germany or elsewhere. And this became kind of a very, very bottom-up action. This was very kind of organized by, like, I read it, I think, in The Guardian, the story about this girl organizing this Facebook page, and she wasn't alone, as suggested. So that's just kind of, but yes, absolutely, access such as it is, the non-access is mediated by access to funds and know-how.
Yes, abortion is not fully free in Russia as the first one. So even though it is covered by the health service as such, it's also, there's going to be big disparities in terms of regional versus urban areas. And I suspect, and again, I'm speculating wildly here, internet access is going to be a massive issue simply because of access to information, as such it is in Russia. One of the guides I've been looking at today, which seems to be in reaction to a lot of the crackdowns, has been from Medusa, which is classed as a foreign agent because it's based out of the Baltics. But I'll just post that in if anyone wants to take a look at it. Which is, it's all the information that people need about what abortion is. So there's going to be a lot of stuff going through the internet, but of course you've got to get online first. That's not always going to be the easiest to do. Also, as part of the 2017 changes, they introduced a compulsory waiting period. So between going and asking for help and then any procedure happening. So very much, again, something we've seen in the US, the idea that people need to be counselled and ideally talked out of it. So that again is going to have an impact, not only in terms of economic access, but also people who have sufficient support, or just the ability to be resilient enough to go through with the procedure that means they've got to wait and go back again and repeat it, particularly if there's people persuading them not to and giving them the pressure to have children as well. So in that sense, the idea is that ideally they want women to give birth rather than having abortions. The assumption is that by restricting access and by providing more support, and it is a two-pronged approach, that they will be able to address some of the issues that they think are currently making women choose to have abortions. It's a pretty naive approach, though. In terms of it doesn't recognize the bigger context of economic inequality, domestic violence we've seen is going to be a big issue. So there's going to be a lot of people who will not get access, even if on paper it looks like they will. And a lot of it then is going to move into the informal spaces of, can they find access to information? Is there any opportunity? And that's going to vary hugely by proximity to other countries as well. If you're in St. Petersburg, I suspect you've probably got some of the best chances versus if you're in Novosibirsk or other places.
Yes, thank you for your responses. And we have a hand from Professor Shigo. Can you?
Yes, can you hear me? I think my internet connection is a little bit unstable, but first of all, I'd like to thank you for this really, really terrific discussion, just excellent lectures, and I cannot wait to use the recording in my class. This term I'm teaching a class that I know Kate taught really successfully here at Queen's a few years ago. So anyway, thank you for that. As I was, after Iryna brought up the question of economics, I was thinking, I started thinking about this as well in terms of, in the context of this question of how come there's more protest in, if I look at the region, the whole Central and Ethiopian region and Russia, how come there is less protest in some cases where women are economically less empowered? The gender gap has become much bigger, like in Romania, for example, Hungary as well, compared to where they were even at the beginning of the 2000s. And by the way, if I remember correctly, in 2004, the gender gap was still smaller in the eastern part of Europe than in Western Europe, for all kinds of reasons. It's like, you know, the onion that we would have to start peeling away, but it was still doing on average better. And then I can actually, if I can share the screen, I can even show you a really nice chart that Eva Fodor, sociologist in Hungary who studies gender, has created, which shows the differentiation in the gender gap. So that is just one indicator, but it shows that there are in some societies women are doing even more poorly, and yet there is very little resistance that's visible, observable, right? And Romania has the worst gender gap, and I do not foresee anti-abortion laws coming in the near future in Romania, because that's where it was the harshest during the Ceausescu dictatorship. I don't know if you've seen the film that was an award-winning Romanian film, came out in 2000, I don't know, tense 4 months, 3 weeks, 2 days. It's an excellent film that's painful to watch for someone like me who grew up in Romania, and I was old enough to actually know stories like that. But anyway, so in Romania, I can imagine that at least for another generation, the memory will be there, and they may not start introducing anti-abortion laws. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is this rearrangement going on of women's disempowerment, which I think started with the motherhood penalty, right? Immediately after, in the early 1990s. And so there's this combination of pressure on women to give birth to the right kind of people, right? To the right kind of new generation, because of some kind of nationalist ontological insecurities. But at the same time, there's motherhood penalty because of the new capitalist modes of economic production and exchange that came in. And there's disempowerment, and that also creates less interest in motivation in organizing and protesting, even in countries like Romania, where there is a lot of protest, anti-establishment protest otherwise. But so I guess the question is whether you see any kind of pattern in what makes some settings or women in some settings more likely to protest. Is it in Poland because there was already a tradition of solidarity and resistance, and that's why women go out and protest? Or in Hungary there are anti-Orban protests, but even though the politics is very similar to what goes on in Poland, you don't actually see the same strength among women in Hungary. I don't know if my question makes sense, but not on this, not on protests. When you see protests, civil society movement demonstrations in Hungary, but this particular question, the anti-gender, anti-LGBT politics that the Fidesz regime is really forcefully conducting, practicing, does not get the same kind of resistance, I don't think, in Hungary. Or am I wrong on this?
So I'll give it a little stab, and please, again, this is a very speculative answer, but I would say, what was I going to say? There was something brilliant there that went away. Kai, please rescue me. I'll remember in a second.
I came in as you started talking about Hungary, so I'm hoping I haven't missed something crucial. Ah, there we go. So great document. Yeah, my sense, I mean, if we're thinking about Hungary in particular, I mean, I was following it more closely a couple of years ago, mainly due to being at CEU in the summer for teaching. But also, I mean, certainly I was very struck by Andrei Peto's recent declarations as well, and sort of gender studies has been under attack very strongly for quite some time. My sense is it is a lot about what resonates and how directly relevant it is. So I think in Hungary, in Russia, there is high levels of support for policies that are seen to promote a moral order that people are not feeling constricted by. The threat is sufficient that justifies it. And so levels of support stay high. I mean, Fidesz's level of support amongst women is very high. You know, and exactly the same with Putin in particular. There has been a complete cult of personality with it, where, you know, he was voted, you know, Russia's sexiest man. He's been termed the ideal husband. You know, there have been pop songs entitled "I Want a Man Like Putin." There is this, you know, real sense of that, and you know, but this also speaks to very, very low expectations, but an attraction to sort of this very, you know, stereotypical hypermasculinity. I think it was Lyudmila Putina, when they were still married, that says, "Of course, my husband looks like a vampire, but he doesn't beat me, so he's the perfect man." If that's your low standards, if it's basically, I'm not being physically put in danger by this man who I share my life with, then okay. You know, we're not looking at high standards here. I think the other thing is that the double burden does really deplete people's space for activism in visible ways. And if you're in a situation where you are economically active, where you are working hard to do that, to support your family, and where you know, you may get some freedoms, so you may be able to divorce, you may be able to separate, but that then means the entire burden is on you. So single parents, for example, your priority is survival. It's not going to be on, you know, you've got to pick how you engage, and that means it will be in lower ways and in ways that we may not recognize directly, particularly given Western traditions of very visible public activism, as resistance. But I think what that speaks to is resistance takes many more forms than we're used to thinking about. Protests are in some ways spectacles. They can be very communal processes, but there's a lot that's got to go on underneath them for them to really be impactful as well. So I wonder if, you know, all of those factors play in different ways, as well as, you know, the costs of protesting or raising one's head above the parapet.
So thank you, Kai. I would add, in the context of Poland, maybe the simple strength of the state, in that the Polish state, there is this kind of a co-constitutive relationship that's going on. Because the protests are large, the state has less capacity to contain them and less willingness to actually go hardcore. I mean, Kaczynski isn't Putin, and like, thank God for Poland, right? Like, I mean, and that's like, this is not a statement that comes easily out of anybody's mouth, but like, he is just, I think, less ready to to be ruthless, and Putin less so. And I would, if I were to be comparing Poland to Hungary, I would say it is mostly lying in media diversification. I mean, Hungary is absolutely by now notorious in having it centralized, and I don't have to be telling Zsuzsa about it. But in Poland, it's that doesn't exist. That just simply doesn't exist. Although my presentation actually had another chapter which I decided to scrap, and it had to do with the power of the church. So can I give you a little bit of indication of how powerful the Polish church is in terms of media? Okay. So Polish Catholic Church has 120 publishing houses, 300 newspapers, 38 radio stations. It has 117 transmission towers. The next biggest private network has 10. Let me repeat this. Catholic Church has 117 transmission towers. The next private network has 10. So when we talk about the media diversification in Poland, it exists and it's real and it's undeniable. However, once you get into a certain echo chamber, which is controlled by the Catholic Church, you are there for good. However, if you are willing to look elsewhere, you will have access to lots of other things, lots of other sources of information, and that's the difference with Hungary. That would be my stab at this.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very fascinating question. So Tadek, would you like to go next?
Thank you. And thank you for two fascinating talks and for the discussion. My question is about this issue of vulgar language used during the protests in Poland, and perhaps less so in Russia, although it is still there during some protests, vulgar language or some other act that would be considered vulgar by some. And I wanted to ask, how do you feel it affects the dynamics of the protest, and how does it act as a mobilizing force in the Polish context, and in the Russian context? Why is it not there, or why is it not there to such an extent as it was in Poland? Thank you.
Anger, I don't know. I think that I don't have a good answer to this excellent question. I think that all protests in Poland were more than only angry. They were angry outwardly, but inside there was this carnival, there was a party, people were really trying to be creating very joyful occasions while they were also incredibly careful about doing it by distancing, etc. They did not want to be shut down on the front of COVID. Why this anger? Why was this? So protests usually have to have a degree of anger in that they act on a grievance. And now the question is, how do you frame your grievance? Do you frame it in one way or another? Here they decided to go for this visible rejection of the scripted role of femininity that requires a woman, and that which is woman, to not swear. So I think this was just simply a degree of frustration and a degree of maybe, if you, there was just maybe, and I'm speculating why the form, I think the conversation, I think the women were trying to move the conversation into that other register, into that conversation about how gender is constructed. They wanted to communicate more than one thing. Yes, we're organizing about abortion, but we're also organizing against all that other stuff that you're throwing at us about defining our role, defining who is a woman, defining how is one to be a woman, and then what is one to do when one belongs to that hallowed and yet unsupported group. So I would just sort of say that there was wisdom in it, in that it was organizing around the issue that had broad resonance, and yet it was actually attacking the government in a kind of very sophisticated way by saying, no to your vision of what womanhood is and no to your right to declare it, I think. But that's very speculative.
Yes, this one, actually, I start to feel that we're beginning to get a bit ridiculous, but at the same time as we had the anti-blasphemy laws, there was also an anti-obscenity law passed in Russia, which affects the media. So the law banned all swearing in films, TV broadcasts, theatres and media, with quite hefty penalties. So this is all part of this crackdown on free speech that we've seen in terms of the internet, but also media being increasingly controlled. So fines are quite a good way of disincentivizing people from doing it, and particularly because organizational fines are larger, it means even if you may have observed it in person, it's probably not going to get shown or recorded in media. So yeah, time for some field work, I guess. I think beyond that, though, there is also the sense of what would have been gained from swearing, in terms of if you've got a situation where there's high support for traditional values and for gender roles and so on, as well as, you know, social taboos and that sense of discomfort with particular words or phrases. And Russian mat is highly gendered in terms of if you look at which words get used for what. I think strategically it would have made it a lot harder to be heard. There's also an element of spectacle, particularly if we think about the LGBT protests. A lot of them have been in English as well, which means the audience is not necessarily domestic. It's very much, it's the international spectacle. It's looking transnationally. It's looking to gain publicity outside of Russia. And that certainly plays in. And the final factor is the risk of being prosecuted for hooliganism. So that's what happened to Pussy Riot in 2012. In fact, we could also look at Kazakhstan for that. Jana Sekabayeva with feminist Feminita in Kazakhstan was arrested for petty hooliganism for a protest that involved acknowledging publicly that women menstruate. So the willingness to use the laws and this idea of hooliganism, which sounds quite quaint, but is something that can be used to discipline people, as well as to enforce those stigmas and taboos, is still very powerful. So you've got to have a certain degree of anger and know that you're going to be able to carry it. Otherwise, it's just another reason to get arrested, or at least detained temporarily.
Thank you. That was a very interesting question. Yeah. So Vasily, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you, Iryna, and many thanks to speakers. And I have a question about the issue of ideology that you mentioned. And I wonder if there is any sort of intellectual frame of reference for all of this, for what government says, for what protesters say. It's I give you the historical parallel I'm thinking of. It's just like the history of anti-Semitism in Russia, part of my field. So in 1880s, Russia had violent pogroms. Anti-Semitic thought came in the beginning of the 20th century, like 2 decades later. Before that, there is nothing, and it's highly unrealistic that these Russian peasants who participated in anti-Jewish violence read Wagner or Drummond or Chamberlain or whoever. It's so. What do you think? Because I see Putin and other government officials as merely speakers who tap their knowledge or their conceptualization of their policies from somewhere else. So yeah, I wonder if there is any intellectual frame of reference for all of this. Thank you.
Alexander Dugin, we can't get away from him in terms of articulating Russianness in particular ways, and ways that have been very influential, then certainly his influence on Putin since the early 2000s, if not previously, has come through very strongly. It offered a third way beyond the either Slavophile or Westernizing discourse. So we moved to this position of Russia having a unique civilizational identity. And that, I think that's been very persuasive as a space, and it's encouraged Putin and those aligned with him to occupy that space and say that they can find it. We do also have to look transnationally, though. I mean, the World Congress of Families is often seen as an American organization. It was actually founded by Russians with Americans. It's one of these weird ones. That if you read their manifesto, effectively saying that they want to go back to this pre-industrial sort of natural state, it's very clearly influencing this idea of the traditional family and natural values understood in a particular way. So I think those two are the ones that really come to mind as the uttermost ones. And then, to my shame, I have forgotten who says, who goes with the Samada Javier. It's effectively sovereignty, orthodoxy, Tsar. One was the other one that comes through very strongly, but that seems to have been Uvarov. Thank you. That one, I think, has been lurking in the background less explicitly, but it's always a question of who then gets to mobilize things. And on that one, I think we do come to Deakin very quickly as a figure who has had notable influence.
Do I understand correctly that it's nothing compared to like Marxism in the Soviet Russia and in the Soviet Union, just the Putin's random choice of Deakin?
I think in terms of assigning it to one individual, it's not necessarily random, but Deakin is no Marx, would be a fair statement. I think there's been a confluence of different things that have come together in terms of sort of different right-wing groups that have got their own ideologies that have found space within traditional values. I think it also reflects the fact of one of the things about Putin that people often forget is he's a pragmatist. He wants to stay in power. And he will draw on whatever he needs to do that. So if Deakin's useful and he could find a way to make it do that, but he's not an ideologue in the sense of wanting to hold to a very specific ideology. He's a political beast, and that needs to be borne in mind.
If I may add, I want to in some ways suggest that, and that may get us back to the issue of economic issues, that part of it resides in the kind of the failures of liberalism. And it's the critiques are perhaps the most sophisticated in Orban's version, but they have massive intellectual backing. I mean, I interviewed people in Poland who were professors of philosophy who were writing it. So I think it has to do with the kind of the double speak that's inherent in liberalism, and that you say one thing and do another, like, we're all equal and yet we're quasi-apartheid when you're in America. But also this idea that you don't impose values and then you make us accept the gays, right? So there's this, right? Like there's both a strategic deployment and a deep suspicion, a legitimate suspicion of what liberalism does best. It kind of says, oh, we are not about imposing anything as American empire trumps through the world. So I think that, and there is this kind of staking a ground, which is contra that. And I think you see it in Trump, you see it in all the illiberal leaders that emerge in Europe. And I think that there is a growing philosophical stand on which they are going to build, and the rest is smart politicking. I would not I agree with Kai. I think that Putin is a smart politician, not simply a mouthpiece. And plus there is a lot of experimentation and borrowing across borders. They are all looking at each other and what they're doing and borrowing to the way they can. I mean, I again heard it explicitly that people in peace wanted to do what Orban could do and couldn't do it, but they were looking and they were watching and wishing upon a star. So that's just to say that there are transnational networks and they're not simply Eastern Europe. And then there is an emerging anti-liberal agenda that's solid, and it will bring all these, the sovereignty, the morality, the family will all come together.
Well, this was Putin announcing the end of the liberal order.
Yeah.
I mean, he explicitly just said it's over. So yeah, he's not just a mouthpiece. He has got influence, but equally, I think he's more of a manipulator than the originator of ideas. Might be a nice way to put it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Tadek, for this rich question that brought us lots of thoughts and discussion. And we have some time, and I invite Antonina and then Rania ask their questions, and then we can conclude. Yeah.
Actually, it's almost a question and comment in one. Regarding vulgarity and wording and anger. I'm biologist by trade. So I know that the main instinct in animals, including human beings, are sex, sexual drive, and food. So basically it's for all animals. So, so it's so strong, and it's so, actually it's working. So in every language you will find swearing words, including English ones, related to process of copulating. Okay, it's just my explanation to why Polish people and pussy rights are using this wording, because this definitely is close to heart of everyone, and it hurts. So, and the second, as I look on Russia and Poland, they're just countries of representative of the world that is moving towards from developing state into so-called developed country, okay? And every biological population has success and sign of success if they have certain reproductive rate. And what I can see right now is that this is statistics, that every country in the world, I mean Western world, of course, and Russia and Poland and India and China and Japan, they have a birth rate less than 2. So how to sustain and to make a workable population of your country is a big question to everyone, except Africa and Middle East, I believe, Middle East. So what happened now, Western democracies are attractive point for immigrant. So excessive immigrants from Africa and Middle East, they are flowing into developed country. However, Russia and Poland and Lithuania and Estonia are not such attractive. Ukraine and Belarus, not attractive points for foreigners to come and settle. And
Antonina, I'm sorry. So just to keep us in our schedule, we can.
Yes. So what I would like
Yes.
just to, isn't it just a demonstration how a particular country, Poland or Russia, are dealing with situation when they have to contain their own population? So all these like rules, etc. This is a question.
Yes, thank you, Antonina. And maybe we can also combine Iryna's comment or question, and then our speakers will have some concluding remarks.
Interestingly, mine was prompted by Tadek's question as well about language. And this also harkens back to my dissertation work. Poland and Russia, in terms of the traditional feminine being associated with the archetypal feminine, the mother goddess. My sense is that in Poland, the Virgin Mary is a much stronger archetype than in Russia. So in terms of essentialist feminine identity, therefore the language of protest also might be reflecting that distinction in terms of the traditional feminine. Just wondered if you thought that might have any traction to it.
Sorry, if I could just ask a clarifying question. So are you suggesting that because Poles consider Virgin Mary to be their queen, that they will somehow have a stronger attachment to notions of femininity tied to, on the one hand, virginity and purity, and on the other one, procreation of little gods?
I'm thinking of it more in kind of Jungian archetypal terms, you know, the psychological impact, and you know, that women in terms of purity and so forth, the idea of vulgar language being associated with them because of the influence of the Catholic Church. I thought it might be different from in Russia.
I think that you're absolutely right, that there is this undercurrent of notwithstanding the presence of women in public spaces and having them be very strong and outspoken, the understanding that they are to make room for male speaker, to maintain a certain purity, to maintain certain composure, interpoise, it exists, even though it of course gets to be contested on a daily basis, not in protests, but simply in life. But I mean, you know, the ideal of purity never had much to do with real women. But I think that you might be absolutely right, that this kind of deepens the sophistication of the vulgarity, that we reject your ideal. We reject that underwriting, the script that makes us into reproducers of nations and pure to boot.
Thanks.
I'm with you on the interpretation of the Polish one, and it makes sense that the Russians are in a different category because, you know, you don't have the Virgin Mary because we're on Orthodoxy, but, and I've just in a very self-promoting way put a chapter in the chat. I've been looking explicitly about how Mother Russia as a concept has been used and how is effectively the referent object of all of these securitizations. So it holds that sort of, it's sacred space in a slightly different way from within the Catholic Church, but certainly I think it does explain a lot about the gender dynamics. But the way in which it's also been pressed into service of the state as a representation of the country, so the link into patriotism, I think makes it far harder to reject it wholesale. There's also just a complexity with Russian womanhood, I think, on the one hand being seen as something that is deeply, deeply feminine, but also the more folk tales about Russian women being very strong, very capable. It's I'm not going to attempt it in Russian, but the old phrase that, you know, can stop a horse on the run and run into a burning house. So I think there's some complexity there that plays out in terms of national identity as well. And without the religious overlay, you've got the mother figure within the Orthodox Church is not as easy to push back against, partly because it's such a have lots of children and be a good wife role. So it's differently configured there, but certainly if you look at how the queer peril's been configured and how it's very much trying to put the Putin's government and the state in a position of protecting Mother Russia as a concept. And I think we could probably do some fascinating comparative work looking at Mother India and other countries that have got a mother figure here, and the ways in which they serve to mediate representations, but also experiences of femininity. So yeah, that should be probably another project we should put on the long list of things to do when we all have time.
If I could just jump in and attempt to answer Antonina a question very, very quickly. I am not necessarily sure that I agree with many of the premises of the question. The idea that we all do sex has nothing really to do with the actual birth rates of countries. Those are two entirely different propositions, and they don't have to translate into one another. And the fact that most countries actually do have problems with natural reproduction presents a problem, but it doesn't present a solution. There is nothing that follows that says you need to produce more babies. What you could be doing is you could be accepting immigrants that are knocking on your door, who are coming because we produced a climate catastrophe that is rocking Africa. They're not coming because life is only better in Africa. They're coming because we're burning their continent. So I think, so the idea that we are needing to solve this problem by having more local babies is a political decision, but it's by no means the only political decision. We could open our borders to immigrants and reproduce ourselves differently. And have joyous sex and not have to have children. And so that would be kind of my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe on this note, we can try to conclude, and I would like to thank warmly to all participants, to their speakers for such fascinating talks, very thought-provoking questions and ideas, and I'm really happy to see many of you all the time that we have organized these panels this year, and some of you became already permanent participants, joining us from different places and continents. And thank you for supporting Russian and Eastern European Studies Network. And for this panel, I would like to thank Dr. Korycki and Dr. Wilkinson for coming up with this idea of organizing this event, and to Dr. Shidrin for putting everything together. And yes, thank you everyone again. And it was a great honor to be a part of this panel. And I will give opportunity to say some final words to Vasily, and thank you so much again.
Okay, thank you, Iryna, for your great work, and thanks to you, we have very structured and very meaningful discussion. And I think Kai and Kate, maybe you say something in conclusion. It's your panel after all, not mine. Thank you.
Maybe I will just say thank you to such a wonderful audience. It is not often that one comes to a panel and gets to have questions that just take us onto speculative journeys and spark new projects. So thank you for being a wonderful, wonderful audience.
Yeah, I can really only echo that. It's one of those times where you go, oh, so many ideas, and so I feel inspired to go away and continue trying to explore further and refine the arguments, but also remember that we are talking about people's lives, and this has got direct relevance as well, and to be able to treat it with the respect and the nuance that it really needs as we try and unpick it, because I think, as we've learned, it's very complex. It's neoliberalism, it's gender, it's everything. So, but thank you all for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And the full video recording of our panel will be available shortly on the REIS YouTube channel. So you can check it out there. You can use it for your teaching. You can use it to relive tonight's experience. It was great to see all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for great panel. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.